Hi everyone. In this video we're going to look at the main line of the Scandinavian defense, which you're looking at right here. So black immediately strikes at white's center pawn on e4. He also opens a diagonal for his light squared bishop, and white has nothing better than to take that pawn. I suppose you could try guarding it with knight c3, it's a possibility, or pushing the pawn forward to e5, or there's even a funny, probably dubious gambit, knight f3 called the Tennyson gambit, and then black takes the pawn and the knight moves to g5, and white tries to recover the pawn on e4. But the best move and the main line is e takes d5, drawing the queen out. However, there is a major alternative. Sometimes you'll see players play knight to f6 in this position, trying to recover the pawn with a knight rather than bringing the queen out early, and that's called the modern variation. But we're not going to take a look at that in this particular video. We might look at that later. Instead, we'll look at queen takes d5, and then white gains a tempo by developing his knight to c3. This move actually has a drawback, though. It's blocking in the c pawn. White might like to push that c pawn to c4 and the d pawn to d4 and gain some space here, and the knight is blocking that. So because of that, I would recommend looking into the possibility of perhaps playing knight to f3 instead. That queen is not going to be stable on d5 for long, so when it moves, you will get your tempo then. You don't necessarily have to get it right away. However, the main line does proceed knight to c3, and then the queen must retreat somewhere, and a sensible square is on a5, where it won't be attacked or harassed again for some time. Although another major alternative that's been played a lot in recent years is queen to d6. That's becoming popular. All right, but we're going to look at queen to a5, and then d4, gaining space in the center, opening the diagonal for the dark squared bishop, and influencing this important e5 square. White is going to try to stop black from taking his share of the center with the move e5. In fact, black doesn't normally play e5 here. It looks possible because the queen is supporting that, but white gets good development really quickly with knight f3. And then if the pawn pushes forward, the knight is pretty good on e5 here, and white should be able to round up that pawn on e4 later. All right, so instead of e5, the main line continues knight to f6, just developing towards the center, and then knight f3, and that puts any dreams of pushing the pawn to e5 to rest. In fact, this knight on f3 often occupies the e5 square itself. It makes a good outpost here supported by the d4 pawn. Then c6 is normally played. That pawn does guard these important squares on b5 and d5 and restricts the white knight here on c3. But more importantly, it creates some escape squares for the queen along this diagonal. And that might be necessary if white plays bishop to d2 and points his bishop right at the queen. So we get some escape squares here. All right, and then bishop to c4. And that's a good developing move towards the center, and it hits this weak f7 square. And it's ironic that this move, bishop to c4, is actually designed to facilitate queenside castling. Looks like a strange statement to make considering we just vacated these squares for kingside castling. But the point is, white would like to develop his queen to e2 in order to get ready to queenside castle, and the bishop gets out of the way so the queen won't be blocking it in. Okay, so bishop to c4, sensible move. And now black should probably develop his light squared bishop. He wants to get it outside of the pawn chain before pushing his e-pawn to e6. And most players will develop it to f5. That's the main line. Let's take a look at the possibility of putting it on g4, and let's see why players don't normally do this. First of all, don't make the mistake of thinking that there's a common tactic here. Bishop takes f7 check is actually a blunder. King takes bishop, and then knight to e5 check looks like you're picking the bishop back up again on g4, but you're not because black has queen takes e5 check. And then pawn takes queen, bishop takes queen, and black's going to lose another piece here. He's got 2 under attack, but he will remain 1 piece up, so white is losing. So you don't have that tactic, but instead, if black plays bishop to g4, what you can do is try to go for the bishop pair. You can play h3, followed by g4, and then knight to e5, nice outpost, and you can pick off that bishop on g6 at any time. So I think that's why people don't play bishop to g4. Instead, bishop to f5 is the main line, and then bishop to d2, getting closer to queenside castling and pointing the bishop directly at the black queen. Now it turns out that white does not have a good discovered attack with his knight just yet, so black takes the time to push to e6 now that he has the bishop outside of the pawn chain. He wants to develop his other bishop. Now that's the main line, but let's go back and consider what happens if the black player's a little skittish and plays queen to c7. Sometimes you'll see people do that. Once you put the bishop on d2, they don't want any discovery, so they put the queen back. Well, it turns out that's a bit of a tempo loss, and white can again pursue the bishop pair, starting with knight to e5, attacking f7 with both the bishop and the knight. So that induces black to push the pawn to e6, and then you can play g4. And that pawn is guarded twice by the knight and the queen, so the bishop might fall back. It might go to e4, but then you can push f3 if you want to. And you can expand further with h4 and attack that bishop. When you expand on the king side with these pawns here, that's gaining time. That's actually good because you intend to castle queenside anyway. And if black castles kingside, then you can launch an attack with your pawns. So you can pick off that bishop at any time. So I think that's why the main line doesn't continue with getting scared of that bishop on d2 and dropping the queen back. Instead, e6 is played, which stops that whole plan of knight to e5 gaining a tempo on f7. And then queen to e2 is the main line, and getting ready to castle queenside and putting some pressure down the e-file right in line with the black king, pinning that pawn on e6. The main line continues bishop to b4. It's now time to address the possible discovered attack on the black queen. Let's look at some other alternatives that don't address the discovered attack. For example, you may have noticed that when white played queen to e2, the c pawn is now hanging, but it's too dangerous. It's a mistake for black to take that pawn. Look at the position for a minute. You'll see white has a big lead in development, and the black king is still in the center of the board. And so there should be some tactics here that favor white, and there are. White can push d5, and that puts 3 attackers on this e6 pawn, the bishop, the pawn, and the queen. And so black really has nothing better than c takes d5, but that opens up a diagonal, and bishop to b5 check is very strong. Now there are 2 reasonable ways you might deal with that check. We'll look at both. Maybe knight b d7 is a possibility, but then white does have a discovered attack on the queen with knight takes d5, and the queen is forced back to d8. And then knight to e5 is decisive. The threat here is knight takes f6, removing the defender of the d7 knight, followed by capturing the knight on d7. And there's no defense. You cannot play e takes d5 and open up the e-file because the queen is sitting here. And if you try knight takes d5, well, then there's bishop takes d7 check, and you don't want to lose your queen, so you move the king up. And then queen to f3 is very powerful with a double threat on f7, and queen to a3 is a threat as well. So you can't hold that position as black. So backing up, another way to deal with this check is to play knight to c6, and that doesn't work out so well either. Again, white plays knight takes d5 with a discovered attack on the queen. Queen has to fall back to d8. And now knight takes f6 check, and black can recapture with either the queen or the pawn, but either way white's plan is the same. He'll move rook to c1, attacking the bishop, and when the bishop moves out of the way, he'll play rook takes c6, and this is devastating. So white is up a piece, and black doesn't even want to take that rook. B takes c6 is going to be met with bishop takes c6 check, forking the king and the rook, and king would have to step up to e7, and there's bishop to b4 check, and it's just terrible. So going back, because of this, bishop takes c2 is really impossible here. There's just too much tactics in the position. The thing you want to remember if black deviates from the main line is try to remember this move d5 as a possibility. Analyze that as a possibility. Another move you might see that does not deal with the possible discovery on the queen that looks reasonable is knight b d7, a developing move here, but that loses, it doesn't lose, but it gives you a bad position due to the same move d5. And then there's a lot of pressure on e6 again, and black has nothing better than to capture on d5. And then knight takes d5 with a discovery on the queen. Queen falls back to d8. I suppose you have to also consider queen going to c5. But then here knight takes f6 check, g takes f6. Knight to d4 threatens the bishop on f5, and it's really threatened because the pawn on e6 is pinned. It can't recapture. So the bishop falls back, and then castle's long, and white is just doing really well in this position. Has a lead in development, has pressure down the d file. He can move his bishop to b5 and pin the knight. It's just a really good position for white. So going back here, after queen to e2, black should deal with this possible discovery on his queen, and the main line is bishop to b4 to block any discovered attack. The only other move you could consider there perhaps is queen to c7, I suppose, getting out of it that way. Okay, but then white castles as planned, castles long as planned, knight b d7 to continue development, and now white can go for the bishop pair with a3, and then bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and the queen falls back to c7. And black can play like this. If you check the engine, it gives white only a plus 0.3, so a slight advantage here. But I do like white. White has the bishop pair, and he has more space in the position due to his advanced center pawn. And black had to be really careful in that line. It was really white with the free hand in that opening. So I think it's a success for white. Anyway, I wanted to mention that if you look in the description below this video, you'll see a link to this page that I'm using right here, and you can play through these moves and read my commentary. And if you go to the second chapter, if you click over here on the left where it says practice, then I'm going to preview this. You can play through the moves of the main line just to test your memory. It says play the white side of the Scandinavian defense main line. So you play a move and the computer will respond. Then you play another move and the computer will respond. Just test your memory. And if you play a move that's not the main line, it'll tell you to retry. Not that it's a bad move, but we're just testing if you can remember the line that I just went through in the video itself. And try to think of a reason behind each move rather than just blindly memorizing. All right, hope you learned something from this video. I sure did. Thanks for watching. I'll see you for the next video.